I'm Jim Peck. Welcome to MSU Today in studio. Dr. Terrie Taylor is here with me today. For more than 25 years, she's worked on malaria research here and in Africa. Dr. Terrie Taylor, welcome.
Thanks.
Why malaria?
Malaria is a major killer of kids all across Africa, and when we started in Malawi 25 years ago, that was what the Malawi Ministry of Health prioritized as a research activity.
Does this, we hear about malaria here, but it's kind of on the periphery because we don't really have it in America, do we?
We don't have it in America anymore on a routine basis, but Michigan State's been closed on a number of occasions in the past because of malaria. This is a low, swampy part of Michigan, and on a regular basis, malaria is imported into this country, infects local mosquitoes, and then infects people who never left the country. So yeah, we have it in small doses, and we could have it again, except that we have an excellent surveillance system.
Half of our crew just left to spray themselves with DEET, just so you know. That just freaked them out. I thought that was kind of an old myth that we had malaria here.
No, it's well documented in the MSU archives, and there were periods of time when students had to go to certain halls for breakfast, and quinine tablets were set out at their places for them to take to prevent malaria.
How many people around the world, around Africa, does this affect each year? And I told you I wouldn't ask you any
Hundreds of millions of people. I mean, for a grown-up living in Africa, in a malaria endemic part of Africa, they'll get malaria at least once a year. It's a ho-hum kind of disease for people who are old enough to have acquired immunity to severe malaria. The brunt of the deaths occur in young children, but once you've run that gauntlet, it becomes an annoyance like the flu.
So it's just something you build up a tolerance to or a resistance to? You
build up a tolerance to becoming seriously ill, but you remain susceptible to becoming infected throughout your life.
Is your research only looking at children, or do you look at adults as well?
Up to now, our research has been focused on the kids who are at the high end of the disease, the very sick, comatose, convulsing children. But we were recently awarded a large grant from the National Institutes of Health that will allow us to enlarge our scope and move out into the community and begin to work out what is happening there that determines which children end up at the hospital with severe disease.
For people that don't know, what happens when you get malaria? If you haven't built up a resistance, what happens in these children? What would happen to me if I got
Well, I can tell you what happened to me, because 1 year in the sort of adolescence of my time in Malawi, I didn't take malaria prophylaxis. I didn't take the drugs that are recommended. I just was in a kind of rebellious phase. So that year I didn't take any drugs, and I got nailed with malaria. So what happened was that one night I was called to go into the hospital. So I was woken up out of a sound sleep, and I got up out of bed and I thought, wow, I feel terrible. And I went into work and I took care of the kid, and I took my temperature, and I had a fever, and I thought, better make sure it's not malaria. And I tested my own blood and looked, and I didn't have malaria. I went home. The next day I felt fine, which is typical of malaria because the symptoms come and go as according to the parasite life cycle in your blood. The next night I woke up again in the middle of the night feeling terrible. I pricked my finger, made a blood film, went back to sleep, got up in the morning, put the blood film in my pocket, went back to work feeling fine, and in the middle of the day I started to feel terrible again. I looked at the blood film under the microscope. It was packed with parasites, and I treated myself, went home, laid down on the couch, and experienced what adult Malawians describe all the time as total body pain. It was so painful that I was lying on my side on the couch debating whether or not I should roll over onto my back. So you feel really sick. And I was certain I would never laugh at another joke in my life. And then 2 days later, I was perfectly fine.
Wow. We'll be right back after this. I know it's been a perplexing disease, and you said that it's one that everybody knows about. People know when you say malaria, people realize that term. It's not like something people haven't heard about, but no one really started looking deeply into it until you did.
Well, no, people have been studying malaria for years, and it's very well characterized. But the focus on these young kids with severe disease really took off about 25 years ago, and we started looking at it in Malawi, and a number of other research groups around the continent have been looking at it. But in terms of American academics, this program in Malawi is distinguished by the fact that Michigan State has let me be there for 6 months a year. And in the U.S. academic model, that's very unusual. And I think it's made a huge difference to the quality of the work and to the level of our acceptance in Malawi.
This is a long-term thing. Did anybody ever expect to sort of go in, work at this for a little while, and then, oh, well, they figured it out and they're gone again?
I don't know. But I certainly didn't think I would be at it 25 years later in the same place. It's been a very rewarding scientific study because each question opens up 3 or 4 more questions, and we've been able to follow the trail along all these years.
Are you finding along the way, obviously you're making discoveries, are you finding things that start to resemble a cure, a treatment? Do you feel like you're making headway, or is it all just more questions?
We're making some headway. One of the most interesting findings is that not everything that has been called malaria is malaria. The symptoms are not unique to the disease. So there's nothing about malaria that is just malaria, with the exception of one physical finding that we stumbled upon in Malawi. Everything else could be any one of several different diseases. So the reductionist view has been, if you have these symptoms and you have malaria parasites in your blood, you have malaria. You have a malaria disease. And that's not the case. The malaria parasites can be in the blood and not cause any problem at all. They can be in the blood and be completely incidental to the symptoms. So actually pinning the parasites to the symptoms has been tricky. We were lucky enough several years ago to stumble onto findings in the back of the eye, which allow us to make our diagnosis of cerebral malaria much more secure than it used to be in the past. So I would say that that's been a significant breakthrough, but it doesn't help us figure out exactly what's causing the disease. It just allows us to focus more on the people who actually have the disease.
You also, I mean, how many years ago now you got the MRI, which has been an advance in what? In studying what part of this?
The MRI has been, we've had it now for 2 seasons, 2 malaria transmission seasons in Malawi, and it has allowed us to do a couple of things. We're able to look at these kids who truly have malaria and compare them to the ones who just look like they have malaria. And we've been able to examine kids at different time points throughout their illness. Before, the only real look at the brain that we had was at autopsy, and that was in the kids who failed to survive. So we didn't have any real idea of what was going on in the brains of the kids who were surviving.
So no real way to tell why. You could tell some lived and some died. You could only look at the autopsies, obviously, the ones who passed away. What are you learning about the kids who lived?
Well, it's a little early to say, and we're still in the process of sorting out the information. But there do seem to be characteristic features in the brains of kids with cerebral malaria that may explain some of the neurological syndromes we see in the survivors. We've been able to identify, for instance, that about 10% of kids have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And there is a certain part of the brain that seems to be involved in that. So we may be able to predict that, and we may be able to address that earlier on in the disease. In terms of what may be treatable in the kids, it seems that swelling in the brain is key, but how to go about treating it is still a matter of intense discussion within the group. But we hadn't appreciated that. Even on the autopsies, we hadn't appreciated the degree of swelling because the process of the autopsy obfuscated that. So the MRI, if I had to pick one finding that was surprising that it allowed us to see thus far, I would say it's the swelling.
And we'll be right back. Alberto Marino, who's our director, and I went to Malawi and did a documentary with you there. It was a little bit of a culture shock for us seeing the way this hospital works. When we talk about hospital, it's not the way that people are going to be picturing it in their heads if they've only been to a hospital in the States, is it?
No, no, it is a large, sprawling, apparently chaotic undertaking, which actually is ordered, but it takes a while to appreciate the order.
and we saw that they don't have nurses the way we have nurses. A lot of family members involved in the actual caretaking of the patients.
The nurses are really there to take the vital signs, check temperatures, and give out meds. But in terms of nursing a patient, bathing a patient, feeding a patient, changing the sheets on the bed, etc., there are not nearly enough nurses employed to do that. And so every patient has at least one family member who provides care as well.
When we saw that, you know, walking around the hospital, you see patients in beds and family members in beds, and outside these amazing scenes of people doing laundry, and I mean, quite a community that sort of grows up around this. Is that the sort of thing that is it terrific, or do you wish that hospitals there were the way they are here?
Oh, I think it's terrific, and I think that it's greatly to the patient's benefit to have friends and family around them all the time. I don't know, it would seem odd to me now, I think, to be in a hospital in the U.S. when everybody goes away after visiting hours and the patient is left to their own devices.
I know as we're talking about these things, and I would think some people watching this are going to think, boy, they're talking about kids who are very sick, many of whom don't make it, or at least some of whom don't make it. But as we're talking, you're thinking about this and smiling. Where does that come from, your ability to think about these things and find such hope?
The Malawians themselves are amazingly cheerful, given the duress under which they're operating. So that's infectious, their goodwill and their cheer. And actually, you know, 80% of the kids with malaria survive and do fine, and each of those is a cause for celebration. And for me, one of the most moving things about this group activity on the research ward is that when there is a death, the other mothers will surround the mother who's lost her child and comfort her and accompany her on the long walk to the mortuary. There really is a solidarity there that's very comforting. So it ends up being a very positive experience, I think, for everybody who's involved.
You mentioned 80% of the children surviving. How much of that is due to you and the work that you and your team have been doing?
Oh, that's a good question. I think a significant amount. There are a number of junctures in the evolution of a case of malaria where you need to be on the spot and react. It's not that we're doing anything highly sophisticated. It's that we're staffed and we're aware and we can do the right blood test quickly enough to determine, yes, a blood transfusion is needed now, or this kid has low blood sugar and needs an intravenous infusion of glucose now. And to be able to respond quickly to those important events is what makes the difference. It's not that we have, you know, special skills or knowledge. It's just that we know what to look for and we have the wherewithal to respond when we find something that's gone awry.
You talk about stepping at those moments when the kids really need the help. A lot of these children don't get to you until it's pretty bad for a host of reasons, including that the families they all sort of have to go. They don't have somebody to take care of their home and things like that.
Right. No, and I feel for the moms because there's no way to know that this is the big one in terms of a malaria illness for a child. These kids get 10 or 12 fevers a year. She can't tell that this is going to be the fever that leads on. She can't run into the hospital for every fever for every kid. She'd be going back and forth to the hospital all the time. So she can only react once it's become serious, once the kids started having convulsions or fallen into a coma. Then it's imperative to get to the hospital as fast as possible. So you're right, there's an inevitable delay between when the disease becomes serious and when the child reaches a point where there can be an intervention.
And again, this is Malawi, not Cleveland, where people can't just pile into the minivan and run these kids down the road to the hospital.
And there's no 911, there's no ambulance service to bring them either.
We'll be right back. Another interesting thing that you work on or work with are the medical students that come each year, several times a year. How does that work?
We are able to cope with 3 groups of 8 students.
You say cope with, that's something.
6, well, it's a space issue. It's a space issue at my house and it's a space issue in the hospital. So over the years, we've worked out that 3 groups of 8 students, each for 6 weeks, can come from Michigan State to Malawi.
But they're not studying malaria specifically.
No, I think that that's too narrow a focus. So they're spread around the hospital doing obstetrics or pediatrics or internal medicine or surgery, and they work side by side with Malawian medical students.
What are they getting out of this? I would think, you talked about the mortality of these children. The mortality across the hospital is pretty significant as well, especially compared to American hospitals.
They often have their most abrupt encounter with death at this hospital, because there's not really an intensive care unit the way we think of in the U.S. So in the U.S., if someone deteriorates in a hospital bed, they're rapidly attended to and transferred to the intensive care unit, put on a ventilator, and everything takes place after that. That option doesn't exist. So if someone deteriorates on the ward there, they die. And they die right there in front of everybody. And so it's like an unplugged kind of death, an acoustic death. It just happens. And American students, we don't see that in this country anymore. We see all the technology and all the bells and whistles, and a code is called, and people are defibrillated, and none of that happens. And so it's a very direct,
and you've got
up close and
family
personal.
members.
Family members are there.
Right next to you.
And the family members often are in a state of suspended disbelief until you tell them, until you officially pronounce the patient as having died, and then they start this very cathartic wailing, but it's loud. And to see such a immediate, loud display of grief is often, shaking for the MSU students. So they have that. They have this up-close, direct experience with death. At the same time, though, they see lots of patients who are really sick, who would be transferred also to an intensive care unit here, but they're not because there isn't one. And they see those people get better. So they see extremities of the human condition that improve with very simple interventions, which I think is fantastic because it serves to raise their threshold for panic when they get home. And you realize how much you can do with very simple means. Start an IV, take a blood pressure, give 50% dextrose. You don't need a lot of fancy stuff to address some of the problems that come up. So I think that's good. And the third thing that's great for them is that they become more confident with their physical diagnosis skills. So that seems to be waning here because we can measure and image so much. There, you really rely on your capacity to figure out what's going on with the patient by examining the patient. And people don't come into the hospital till they have to. So they have huge livers, huge spleens, big heart murmurs, whatever. So all kinds of bells sound and whistles for these kids because they're often like, oh, that's what hepatomegaly is. Oh my gosh, that's what a grade 4 murmur sounds like. So it's very rewarding for them.
Is this something that you got into because you had always been fascinated by mosquitoes and malaria and thought, well, I've got to go study this?
No, it wasn't malaria initially that was fascinating to me. It was the understudied nature of these tropical diseases in general. My initial experience was in the Sudan, also with Michigan State, and it was very apparent there that the local clinicians were swamped, coping with this deluge of patients. And they were swamped to the point where they couldn't get enough above the deluge to frame a question to think about a way to slow the torrent of patients that was coming. And it seemed to me that that was a legitimate contribution that a Western physician could make. And I would also be in a position to generate support, research support, to answer those, or to begin to answer those questions. So it was that general inspiration that led me to seek training in tropical medicine, and I serendipitously ended up in Malawi, and Malawi identified malaria as the disease that they wanted studied.
The patients that you see, we talked about how difficult it is for them to get in and then get treatment. Once they leave, are you able to keep track of them?
We do keep track of, we invite everybody back for 1 month to see how they're doing, and if they seem fine, we send them on their merry way, unless we have a study going on that requires long-term follow-up. And then we arrange a way to stay in touch with them, which often involves driving them home and seeing where they live. Now we have GPS coordinates, and we can sort of track people that way. But before, there would be lengthy narratives of how to get to someone's house, and they're very poetic. You know, go to the mango tree, turn right, look for the shop that sells bananas, take a left, ask the village headman for so-and-so, and then you get there. So that you can do it, you can sort of do it with a GPS, but in a way, those written descriptions are more fun.
Is what you want to find a cure?
I would like to find a way to yank back from the brink the kids that have progressed to cerebral malaria. There are plenty of people working on treatments for uncomplicated malaria. That's in very good hands. We have great drugs now. We have wonderful drugs in the pipeline. So that I'm not so worried about. What I'd like to figure out is what the heck is going on with these kids who are unconscious and convulsing, and how we can add something to the drug treatment, the anti-malarial drug treatment for those kids. What is it? What is the process that's going on that's killing them, and can we intervene in that?
Are you close?
We're closer. We're closer, but we don't have a magic bullet yet.
Well, we'll bring you back another 6 months or so and see how the bullet is coming along in the lab. Dr. Terrie Taylor, we are just about out of time. I want to thank you for being with us today, and thanks to my folks that are watching out there for watching MSU Today in Studio. For more on the show, head to our website. I'll see you next time right here on MSU Today in Studio.